I hadn't planned on being in a courtroom at 63 years old. I hadn't planned on a lot of things that happened that year, but there I was, sitting at a long wooden table in a room that smelled like old carpet and recycled air, watching my brother across the aisle like he was a stranger I'd never met. His name is Donald. Donnie. We called him growing up, 4 years younger than me, and for most of our lives, the kind of brother who'd show up late to everything but always with a good enough excuse that you forgave him anyway. Mom used to say he had a gift for making people feel sorry for him. I didn't understand what she meant until it was too late. Our mother passed in March. Eleanor Ruth Calloway, 81 years old, sharp until the very end, the kind of woman who finished the crossword in pen every morning and never once asked for help carrying her groceries. She had lived in the same house in Macon, Georgia for 44 years. The house where Donnie and I grew up. The house where she tended the same rose bushes along the front porch from the time I was in diapers until the week before she died. She left a will. She had always been organized that way, the kind of person who had her taxes done in February and kept her important papers in a fireproof lockbox under the bed. The will was clear. The house and most of her savings were to be split equally between me and my brother. Her jewelry and personal items were to be distributed according to a handwritten letter she had placed inside the lockbox alongside the will. I didn't know about the second document, not until after the funeral. What I did know, standing in her driveway after we buried her, was that something felt off. Donnie had flown in from Phoenix 2 days before she passed, the first time I'd seen him in almost 3 years. He'd been in and out of her life for years, showing up when he needed money and disappearing when things were fine. I was the one who drove her to her appointments. I was the one who sat with her on Sunday afternoons. I was the one who called her every single morning, 7 days a week, for the last 11 years of her life. None of that was written anywhere. It didn't need to be. She was my mother and I loved her, and that was enough. But Donnie didn't see it that way. 2 weeks after the funeral, he hired a lawyer. His name was Preston Hargrove, a man with a tight suit and a voice that never went above a controlled murmur, the kind of man who seemed to have been designed specifically for the purpose of making other people feel like they were in the wrong. He sent a letter to my home claiming that our mother had not been in full mental capacity when she signed the will, and that the equal split was not reflective of her true intentions. He further claimed that I had unduly influenced her decisions in her final years, and that the house should be transferred in its entirety to my brother, along with a larger share of the savings. I read that letter 3 times sitting at my kitchen table in Rome, Georgia, and each time I finished it I felt something cold settle into my chest. Not anger, exactly, something quieter. A kind of grief I hadn't expected, because it meant that my brother had looked at 40 years of my life and decided it was worth taking from me. My daughter found me at that table. Her name is Patricia, but everyone has called her Trish since she was old enough to object to the full version. She is 38 years old, works as a paralegal in Atlanta, and has her grandmother's same habit of asking the question she already knows the answer to, just to make sure you're being honest. She read the letter over my shoulder, set it down carefully, and said, "Dad, do you have any idea what he's actually claiming here?" I told her I understood well enough. "No," she said, and pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. "I mean, do you understand what this is going to require you to prove?" I did not. That was the beginning. The next 8 months were unlike anything I had experienced in my 63 years. I hired a lawyer, a woman named Carol Ennis out of Macon, who had handled estate disputes for 30 years and had the kind of steady, unhurried manner that made you feel like the situation was manageable even when it wasn't. She explained that contesting a will on the basis of undue influence required Donnie's team to demonstrate a pattern of behavior that I had isolated my mother, controlled her decisions, manipulated her into favoring me. She said these cases could become very personal very quickly. She was right. Donnie's legal team submitted affidavits. They found 2 women from my mother's church, neighbors she had known for decades, who signed statements saying they had noticed a change in Eleanor's demeanor in her final years, that she seemed to defer to me more than she used to, that she mentioned me in almost every conversation, that I seemed to make decisions on her behalf. These women weren't lying. Exactly. They just didn't understand what they were describing. My mother deferred to me because she trusted me. She mentioned me because I was there. I made decisions on her behalf because she asked me to. But on paper, in formal legal language, it read differently. I drove to Macon twice that fall to go through her things, trying to find anything that might help: letters, notes, anything in her handwriting that reflected her state of mind, her wishes, her feelings about both her sons. Carol had told me to look for anything dated in the last 2 years, anything that showed independent thinking and clear intent. The house was exactly as she had left it. Donnie hadn't been back since the funeral. The rose bushes along the porch had started to go brown at the edges from lack of attention. I couldn't bring myself to go inside for almost an hour the first time. I just stood on the porch and put my hand on the door frame and thought about how many times I had walked through that door in 60 years and how it had always meant coming home. I went through her desk, her nightstand, the cedar chest at the foot of her bed that she'd had since before I was born. I found birthday cards she had saved, holiday photos, a recipe box with her handwriting on every index card, a small notebook she had used for grocery lists. In the back of the cedar chest, beneath a folded quilt, I found a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine letters I had sent her over the years, going back to when I was in the army in my 20s. She had kept every single one. I didn't find what I was looking for. Not that day. The mediation in November went nowhere. Donnie sat across the table with his lawyer and barely looked at me. When he did, there was something in his face I couldn't quite name. Not guilt, not anger, but a kind of blankness, like he had already decided that whatever happened between us wasn't his responsibility. His lawyer did most of the talking. They were willing to settle, they said, for 65% of the estate to Donnie and 35% to me, plus full transfer of the house. I said no. Carol said that was the right call. Christmas that year was quiet. Trish came up from Atlanta with her husband and their 2 kids, my grandchildren, 9 and 12 years old. We had dinner and put up a small tree, and I tried to be present for all of it. But there were moments that evening, sitting in my living room watching my grandchildren argue over a board game, when I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me and I wondered if I had the energy for what was coming. The trial date was set for February. I didn't sleep well in January. I'd lie awake thinking about things I hadn't thought about in years, specific afternoons from childhood, moments with my mother, the way things had been between Donnie and me when we were young. We hadn't always been this way. There was a long stretch of our 30s when we were close, when he was sober and working steadily, and our families spent holidays together. I kept trying to remember when that changed, and I could never identify a single moment. It just eroded, the way things do when one person keeps taking and the other person keeps allowing it. 3 weeks before the trial, Trish called me on a Sunday evening. She said, "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I told her I was always honest with her. "I know," she said, "but this is different." There was a pause. "Did Grandma ever give you anything? Separately, outside of the will? Any documents? Any written statements? Anything she specifically told you about her wishes?" I thought about it carefully. "No," I said. "Nothing like that." "Okay," she said, and her voice had shifted, not worried exactly, but focused in a way that made me want to ask what she knew. Before I could, she said, "Get some rest, Dad. I'll see you on Wednesday." She arrived Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock with a leather bag over her shoulder and a look on her face that I recognized from when she was a teenager and had already decided something before she walked in the door. She sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd read Donnie's letter the previous spring, and she opened her bag and set a manila folder on the surface between us. She said, "I went to see Aunt Clara last month. Aunt Clara is my mother's younger sister, 80 years old, living in a retirement community outside of Savannah. I had spoken to her at the funeral, but not since, which I felt some guilt about. Clara and my mother had been close their entire lives, the kind of close that comes from being the only 2 daughters in a family of 5 brothers and surviving everything together. She had something she wanted me to give you," Trish said. "She said she had been trying to decide whether to tell you, and that she finally decided you needed to know." She opened the folder. Inside was a letter, 3 pages, handwritten, in my mother's handwriting, dated 14 months before she died. I recognized the handwriting before I read a single word. I had been looking at that handwriting my entire life on grocery lists, birthday cards, recipe cards, the return address on every envelope she had ever sent me. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't expected. I picked it up and I read it. My mother had written it in the spring, on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at Clara's kitchen table in Savannah. She had driven there specifically to do it. She had told Clara she wanted a witness who wasn't involved, someone who would hold it separately, who wouldn't say anything unless it became necessary. She had been thinking about it for a long time, she wrote. She wasn't sure she would ever want it used, but she wanted it to exist, just in case. The letter was not a legal document. It was not a codicil to the will. It was a letter from a mother to her family, written in plain English, and in it she described both of her sons with a clarity and honesty that made me have to set it down twice before I could finish reading. She wrote about Donnie with love. She was always clear about that. She loved him without qualification, the way mothers love their children regardless of what those children do. But she also wrote about the years of borrowing money that was never returned, the missed holidays, the phone calls that came only when something was needed. She wrote about a specific afternoon 3 years before she died, when Donnie had called and asked her to change her will in his favor, telling her that his financial situation was serious and that he deserved more because of things he believed I had done to him years ago, things my mother said had no basis in fact. She wrote that she had been shaken by that call, and that it had led her to write this letter because she wanted there to be a record of her clear thinking and her clear wishes. She wrote about me. She wrote about the Sunday afternoons and the morning phone calls and the way I had never once asked her for anything. She wrote that she did not want anyone to misconstrue her relationship with me as one of control or influence, and that the opposite was true, that I had always encouraged her independence, always made sure she had her own voice. She wrote that she was proud of who I had become. She wrote that the will represented exactly what she wanted. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I finished reading. Trish sat across from me without saying anything. Outside the window, the sky was flat and white with February clouds, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking. Finally, I said, "She wrote this at Clara's house." "Yes," Trish said. "So Clara's been holding it for over a year. She wasn't sure if it would ever be needed. Grandma told her to use her judgment." I nodded slowly. "Does Carol know about this?" "I called her yesterday. She wants to see it today if possible." I looked at my daughter across the table. She had her grandmother's same handwriting. I noticed for the first time the same slight leftward lean, the same way of crossing the letter T low on the stem. I don't know why I noticed that right then. I just did. "Thank you," I said. Trish said, "She was my grandmother. I wasn't going to let this go." Carol reviewed the letter that afternoon and spent 2 hours on the phone over the following days confirming its authenticity and establishing the chain of custody through Clara. The letter had been written voluntarily, witnessed by Clara, and dated, and while it wasn't a legal amendment to the will, it was substantial evidence of my mother's state of mind and her explicit awareness of the potential dispute. It also directly addressed and contradicted the central claim of Donnie's case that I had unduly influenced her thinking. More than that, it demonstrated that my mother had anticipated this. She had known her younger son well enough to see it coming. The morning of the trial, I drove to Macon alone. I had offered to pick up Trish, but she said she would meet me there, and I think she knew I needed the drive to myself. It was cold for Georgia in February, the sky that same flat white as the week before, and I drove through the pine country south of Rome with the heater running and almost no music, just the sound of the engine and my own thinking. I had a strange feeling that morning that I want to try to describe accurately because I think it mattered. It wasn't confidence. Exactly. It wasn't peace. It was more like clarity, like I had finally stopped trying to understand why my brother had done this and had simply accepted that he had, and that the only thing left was to let the truth be what it was. My mother had known. She had sat at her sister's kitchen table 14 months before she died, and she had written it all down. She hadn't shown it to me because she didn't want me to carry it. She had given it to Clara because she wanted it to exist without being a burden to anyone until it needed to be. That was the most like her thing I could possibly imagine, and it made me miss her in a way that was almost unbearable and also somehow a comfort. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, 2 rows of gallery seats, most of which were empty. Donnie was already there when I arrived, sitting with Preston Hargrove, and he looked up when I walked in and then looked away. Carol had prepared me carefully for the morning's proceedings. The opposing team would present their case first, laying out the undue influence argument, calling their witnesses. Then we would respond. The letter from my mother would be entered as evidence during our portion, and Carol intended to call Clara by video testimony to establish provenance. Donnie's team went first, as expected. Preston Hargrove stood up and spoke in that controlled murmur about family and fairness, and an elderly woman in her final years, who had become isolated and dependent. He called the 2 women from my mother's church, who said what they had said in their affidavits, and I sat and listened and tried to hear them charitably because I believed they meant well, and had simply mistaken closeness for control. Preston called one more witness. I hadn't expected it. He called Donnie. My brother took the stand and I watched him. He was 59 years old and looked older than that, his hair gone mostly gray, his hands folded on the railing in front of him. He spoke about our childhood in a way that was selective but not entirely dishonest, emphasizing moments when I had been the one in charge, the older brother, the one who set the terms. He said that in adulthood the same dynamic had continued, that I had positioned myself as my mother's primary caregiver in a way that crowded him out. He said he had tried to be involved, but that I had made it difficult. He said he loved his mother. I believed that part. That was the hardest part to hear, because I believed it, and it didn't change anything. When it was our turn, Carol presented the letter methodically and without drama. She entered it into evidence, walked through the authentication, and then connected via video to a room in Savannah where Clara sat in a straight-back chair in her good blouse, 80 years old and completely steady. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Diane Fulton, had read the letter during a brief recess. When she came back to the bench, her expression was composed and unreadable in the way that experienced judges learn to be, and I couldn't tell anything from looking at her. Clara testified for 20 minutes. She described the afternoon my mother had come to her house, the date, the weather, the specific chair my mother had sat in at her kitchen table. She described my mother's manner as calm and deliberate and entirely herself. She said my mother had told her she was writing the letter because she wanted the truth to have a home somewhere, in case it was ever needed. Clara said she had waited to come forward because my mother had asked her to wait until it was clear it was necessary, and that she had made that determination when Trish had called her. When Carol asked Clara whether she believed my mother had been under any undue influence in her final years, Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Eleanor made up her own mind from the day she was born. Anyone who knew her knows that." Preston Hargrove cross-examined for a while, trying to establish that Clara had a bias toward me, that she and Donnie had never been close, that her judgment was not objective. Clara answered every question with the same calm precision, and at one point, when he suggested that my mother might not have been fully aware of what she was writing, Clara looked directly into the camera and said, "My sister was the most clear-eyed person I have ever known. That is not an opinion. That is a fact." The session recessed for lunch. I sat in the hallway with Trish and Carol, and I wasn't hungry, so I had coffee from a vending machine and looked at the floor and didn't say much. Trish put her hand on my arm at one point and said, "You doing okay?" I said I was. She said, "I know you are." When court resumed, Judge Fulton heard closing statements from both sides. Preston was measured and professional. Carol was equally measured and laid out the evidence clearly and without embellishment. When she finished, she sat down and the room was quiet for a moment. Judge Fulton took the case under advisement for 3 days. Those 3 days were strange. I went home and did ordinary things. I went to the hardware store. I had dinner with Trish and her family on the second evening. I slept better than I had in months, which surprised me. I think the clarity I had felt driving to Macon that morning had settled into something more permanent, a sense that I had done what I could, that my mother had done what she could, and that the rest was simply going to be whatever it was going to be. When Carol called on the third afternoon, I was in my backyard pulling dead growth from the garden bed along the fence. I had my phone in my jacket pocket. When it rang and I saw her name, I set down the clippers and stood up. She said, "The ruling came down this morning." I waited. She said, "Judge Fulton found insufficient evidence to support the undue influence claim. The original will stands. Equal division of the estate." I stood in my backyard with the phone to my ear and didn't say anything for a moment. Carol said, "She also noted in her ruling that the letter submitted in evidence demonstrated clear and independent testamentary intent, and that it directly contradicted the narrative presented by the opposing party." I said, "So she read it carefully?" "She read it very carefully," Carol said. "Your mother wrote well." "She did. She always had." I went inside and called Trish, and she picked up on the first ring, and I could tell from her voice that Carol had already reached her. We talked for a long time, longer than the news itself required, the way you talk when you've been through something difficult together, and the end of it creates space for everything you didn't say along the way. Toward the end of the call, Trish said, "She knew, Dad. She always knew." I said I thought so too. There was a pause, and then Trish said, "She drove to Aunt Clara's house and wrote it all down and tied it up and put it somewhere safe and never told you because she didn't want you to worry. That's just exactly who she was. That's just exactly who she was. I haven't spoken to my brother since the ruling. I don't know if I will. There is grief in that. A particular kind of grief for the relationship you expected to have with someone and didn't, for the version of your family that existed in your head and turned out to be different from reality. I carry that. I suspect I will for a long time. But I also carry the letter. Carol made me a certified copy, and the original is in the court record, and I keep the copy in my own fireproof lockbox. The same kind my mother used, which I bought the week after the ruling. I've read it probably a dozen times, not looking for anything in particular, just because it's her handwriting and her voice and the particular way she put words together when she was being completely honest about something. On the last page, at the very end, after everything she had written about both of her sons and about her wishes and about the will and about the years that had led her to that table in Clara's kitchen, she wrote one more sentence that wasn't about any of that. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was just a thought she had, written down the way she wrote everything plainly, without extra ornamentation, like she was leaving a note on the refrigerator. She wrote, "The truth doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be somewhere. I think about that a lot." She drove to her sister's house and she wrote it all down and she put it somewhere. She didn't tell me. She didn't need to. She just made sure it had a place to exist, in case the day ever came when it was needed. The day came. I'm 63 years old, and I have learned more about my mother in the year since she died than I knew in all the years before it. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with. It means she was carrying something I didn't know about, managing something alone that she might have shared. But I also think I understand why she didn't. She knew I would have gone to Donnie, and she knew that would have made things worse, and she loved both of us enough to try to protect us from each other until she no longer could. That was her. That was always her. I drove back to Macon in the spring to see about the house, to begin sorting out the process of dealing with the estate now that the legal question was settled. The rose bushes along the porch had come back. I don't know if I had expected them to. I hadn't tended them, and no one else had been there. But they had come back on their own the way they had every spring for 44 years, without anyone needing to tell them to. I sat on the front porch for a while before I went inside. It was a warm morning, the kind of morning that smells like cut grass and whatever's blooming, and I sat in the same chair my mother always sat in, and I watched the neighborhood go about its business, a dog being walked, someone backing a car out of a driveway, 2 houses down, a kid on a bicycle, and I thought about how ordinary everything looked from the outside. How you could drive down this street and see this house and have no idea what had happened here, what had been fought over and decided and grieved. From the outside, it was just a house. From where I was sitting, it was everything. I go back every few weeks now. I tend the rose bushes. I keep the porch clean. I haven't decided yet what to do about the house in the long run, whether to sell it or hold it or something else, and I find I'm not in a hurry to decide. My mother lived in it for 44 years. It can wait a little longer while I figure out what's right. Some mornings when I'm there, I make coffee in her kitchen and sit at her table, and the house is very quiet, and I don't feel the need to fill the quiet with anything. It's enough to just be there. It's enough to know that she was there, and that she thought ahead, and that when the moment came, the truth had somewhere to be. That was enough for her. It's enough for me. The people who love us most sometimes protect us in ways we never see quietly, without asking for credit, trusting that the truth will find its moment. Eleanor didn't fight back. She simply made sure honesty had somewhere to live. If someone in your life has ever done something steady and unspoken to hold things together for you, chances are you already know who that person is. Maybe today is a good day to tell them. A small note to our listeners. This story was created and imagined by AI, crafted to bring you an hour of meaningful entertainment, and to carry a little something worth holding on to long after the story ends.